It was a weekend trip, a quiet getaway with my girlfriend at a secluded cabin in the woods. We needed some time away from the city, from all the noise and distractions of everyday life. The rental listing promised peace and quiet, and when we arrived, the place didn't disappoint. Nestled between tall pines, it was just what we needed. A small, cozy cabin with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a couple of bedrooms. After we unpacked, we took a walk around the property. The air was fresh, the smell of pine filling my lungs. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. We were deep in the woods, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. We didn't have much in terms of neighbors, just a few cabins down the dirt road, all spaced far apart. Later that evening, as we were settling in, I noticed an old wooden drawer under the kitchen counter. It was small, with a brass handle that looked a little worn but sturdy. Something about it caught my attention, so I opened it. Inside, there were a few random odds and ends, some old receipts, a couple of pens, and what looked like a weathered guest book. Curious, I pulled it out and began flipping through the pages. The entries were mostly from the 90s, with people writing simple things like, "Great weekend," or "Love this cabin, hope to come back soon." But the more I read, the more I noticed that the entries began to shift. There were a few scribbles that seemed out of place, almost hurried, and a couple of pages had strange, unsettling comments written in a cramped, uneven hand. One entry stood out, dated just a few years ago. It was different from the others, darker, with a strange urgency in the handwriting. It read, "He comes when it's foggy. Don't open the door, no matter how hard he knocks." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was almost laughable, just some cryptic warning, probably a prank. But something about it stuck with me, gnawing at my thoughts as I closed the book and tucked it back into the drawer. That night, after dinner, we sat on the couch watching a movie. The weather had shifted throughout the day, clouds rolling in, and the air grew colder. We hadn't noticed when it started, but by the time the movie ended, a thick fog had settled over the area. The world outside was obscured, the trees now just dark silhouettes in the distance. It was the kind of fog that felt heavy, almost suffocating. The kind of fog that makes everything seem muffled, distant. I stood up to close the window, the chill of the fog creeping into the room through the gaps in the wood. As I walked toward the door to the porch, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, like a knock. I stopped in my tracks, listening. Nothing. I shrugged it off. The house was old, maybe it was just the wind. But then, as I was turning back to the living room, there was another knock. This time I froze. It wasn't a soft tap. It was loud, sharp, and deliberate. 3 knocks. Then, just a few seconds later, another 3. My heart started pounding, my breath catching in my throat. I stood still, not sure what to do. The fog outside had thickened even more, and now I couldn't see beyond the porch. I walked over to the window and peered out, my pulse racing. The porch was empty, nothing but mist stretching in every direction. No sign of anyone. I felt a cold, uneasy knot form in my stomach. The knocking had stopped, but now the air felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes you feel like you're being watched, even if you can't see anyone. Maybe it's just someone lost in the fog, my girlfriend suggested from the couch, her voice a little shaky. She was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in her words. We both knew that it was too quiet, too strange. The fog, the knocking, it was unsettling. I went to the door, peering through the small window next to it. Again, nothing. The woods around the cabin were silent. I considered stepping outside to see if I could hear anything more clearly, but something held me back. The last thing I wanted was to go out into that thick fog, where visibility was barely a few feet. And besides, that feeling of being watched. Didn't that book say something about not opening the door? Maybe we should just lock everything and stay inside, I suggested, my voice a little tense now. My girlfriend nodded, visibly relieved. We made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I double-checked the back door, the one that led into the kitchen, and pulled the blinds down tightly. We sat on the couch, the warmth of the fire in the fireplace making the room feel more secure, but the unease lingered. The knocking came again, louder this time. 3 knocks, followed by another set of 3. I jumped, the sound so sharp it felt like a physical jolt. My girlfriend clutched my arm, her grip tight, her face pale. I could feel her breathing faster, and I could tell she was just as scared as I was. I don't know how long we sat there, in silence, staring at the door. Every now and then, we heard the knocking like a countdown, 3 knocks every few minutes, until it felt like the whole house was vibrating with it. The fog outside seemed to press in, thick and oppressive. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight now. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to say something reassuring, but the fear in my gut wouldn't let me. Instead, I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't sit still anymore. I had to check. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, or maybe there was something else going on. But I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked toward the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but I stopped myself just before I opened it. The warning from the guest book flashed in my mind. Don't open the door, no matter how hard he knocks. I took a deep breath, trying to push the fear down. This was ridiculous. There was nothing out there, just fog, just a weird coincidence. I opened the door, just a crack. The fog poured into the cabin like a living thing, rolling in around my feet, swirling around the edges of the doorframe. The air felt wet, like something was pressing against me, suffocating me. I shone the flashlight into the mist, but all I could see were the blurred shapes of the trees, their trunks twisted and distorted in the haze. No figure, no person, just the empty woods. I was about to close the door again when I heard it. A whisper of movement, something shifting in the fog. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow dart between the trees. Then, nothing, just silence. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my heart racing. Whatever it wasn't human. No one would be out there in that fog, not at this hour, and not in the thick of it. My hands were clammy, and I could feel the weight of the warning from the guest book pressing down on me. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't just a strange coincidence. Someone or something had been out there. We sat in silence for the rest of the night, not daring to make a sound. The knocking continued, but we didn't respond. We didn't even move from our spots. The fog stayed, thick and unyielding, until the first light of dawn began to push it back, revealing the dark outlines of the trees around us. When morning finally came, the fog had lifted. The sun rose slowly, casting light over the cabin and the woods, but it felt wrong. The world outside felt distant, disconnected, like we were still trapped in some sort of dream. I glanced at the door, still locked, still shut tight. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I do know one thing for sure: we weren't alone out there. I'd been looking forward to this solo trip for months. A weekend alone at a friend's hunting cabin in Maine, nestled deep in the woods, far away from anything that resembled the chaos of my everyday life. No distractions, no deadlines, just me, nature, and the silence I craved. The cabin had been in my friend's family for generations, and though it wasn't much more than a basic structure with a few rooms, a wood-burning stove, and a few hunting trophies on the walls, it was perfect for getting away. I made plans to hike, fish, and just clear my head. I didn't expect anything strange to happen. The first morning, I woke up early, feeling the crisp air through the small window beside the bed. It was a feeling that never failed to remind me of how different the woods were from the constant hum of city life. The silence out here was different, deep, almost alive, but calming at the same time. I stretched, grabbed my boots, and stepped outside to get the day started. As soon as I walked out of the cabin, I noticed something odd. Fresh footprints, big ones. They weren't there the night before, at least I was sure of it. It was still early. The ground hadn't fully thawed from the chill of the previous night. The prints were large, deep impressions in the soft earth around the cabin, and they looked like they had been made by someone wearing heavy boots, maybe even work boots. I frowned and scanned the woods around me, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The trees stood still, their dark, bare limbs swaying gently in the breeze. I could hear birds calling in the distance, but nothing else seemed to stir. The prints circled the cabin. There were even some near the back door. The back door was locked when I'd gone to bed. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe a deer had wandered too close, or maybe one of the local hunters had gotten curious about the cabin. Still, the sight left me unsettled. I spent the rest of the day hiking along the trails I had planned, but the strange feeling lingered. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I went back to the cabin. I locked the door behind me, cooked up some dinner, and tried to relax by the fire, but my thoughts kept drifting back to those footprints. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises in the dark, small sounds, branches cracking, something moving through the leaves outside. But when I would get up and look out the window, I'd see nothing. It wasn't until I lay back down that the silence would return, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. The second day was much the same. I woke up to find new prints, this time a little closer to the cabin. They circled around the front of the house, then stopped near the window. Whoever had been leaving these prints had been moving around a lot, covering the same ground multiple times. I spent the afternoon fishing in a small creek nearby, trying to push away the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot were all I could hear. It should have been comforting, but something in the back of my mind wouldn't let go of the unease. By the time night fell again, I decided to stay up a little longer than usual. I had my rifle with me, just in case. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, something moving outside. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. I rose quietly from the bed, the rifle heavy in my hands, and moved toward the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly parted the curtains. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, just beyond the tree-line, I saw him, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still. He was staring directly at the cabin, unmoving. I could barely make out the details in the darkness, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stayed frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. He didn't move for a long time. I kept thinking he would turn and walk away, but he didn't. The longer I stared, the more I felt like something was wrong. There was something off about him. He looked too still, too deliberate. I slowly raised the rifle, taking a careful aim. I'd been in situations where you could never be too sure about the intentions of someone in the woods at night. I didn't want to make any assumptions, but I also didn't want to risk whatever this was. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to notice me aiming the gun. His eyes were fixed on the cabin, his posture rigid. Felt as if he was waiting for something. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my hand. This was it. I had to make a decision. But then, without warning, he started to move. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step backward into the trees, his body fading into the shadows. He didn't hurry, didn't run. He just walked backward, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. I watched him disappear into the dark, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't lower the rifle for a long time. I stayed by the window, waiting to see if he'd come back. I couldn't make sense of it. Who was he? What was he doing out there? And why didn't he seem scared at all? After what felt like an eternity, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what might happen next. I grabbed the rifle and went outside, moving as quietly as I could. The night was still and silent, save for the occasional chirp of a distant insect. I circled the cabin, checking the corners, the windows, the woods surrounding me. There was nothing, no sign of the man, no sounds except for my own breathing and the rustling of leaves underfoot. I stayed awake the rest of the night, rifle in hand, by the fire. But I didn't hear anything more, and by morning, I was drained. The daylight didn't bring comfort. I felt watched even in the sunlight. The next morning, I found more tracks. They weren't as fresh as the others, but they were still there. They circled the cabin again, but this time, they seemed to head deeper into the woods. Whoever had been out there, they hadn't left yet. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't going to stick around to figure out what the hell had just happened. I grabbed my gear, locked the cabin, and drove back down the dirt road, leaving the woods behind. I never told anyone about the man in the woods, but I can't stop thinking about him. What did he want? Why didn't he run when I raised the rifle? And who was he, really? I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, but one thing's for sure. There's something out there in those woods. Something I'll never fully understand. Something that makes me grateful I'll never have to return to that cabin again. It wasn't just the footprints. It wasn't just the strange man in the woods. It was the feeling that, for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone out there. That there was someone or something watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. And it was real. It was the second day at the cabin when I noticed the path. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a narrow trail snaking off behind the cabin, partially covered by dense underbrush. The first day had been all about settling in, unpacking, lighting the fireplace, and enjoying the quiet isolation. The cabin sat on the edge of a deep forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was the perfect getaway for a long weekend, just what we needed to escape the hustle of everyday life. We had no plans other than to relax, maybe take a few short walks around the area. The forest had seemed peaceful at first, a serene haven, but as I stared at that path, something about it felt different. I had wandered around the perimeter of the cabin the day before, taking in the surrounding area, but the path behind it I hadn't noticed until now. It was there, hidden just beyond the cabin's rear porch, and I hadn't thought much of it until I had walked out of the cabin alone in search of some quiet time away from the others. It was early in the morning, the light still soft and misty, casting a quiet grayish hue over the land. I was curious, so I figured I'd follow it for a few minutes. There was no reason not to, after all. The path was overgrown in places, just wide enough for me to slip through, though not without brushing against the occasional thorny bush or low-hanging branch. The earth underfoot was soft, moist from a dew that hadn't yet burned off, and the smell of the damp forest filled the air. The trees were thick, towering pines with their deep green needles, and the occasional birch or oak stood like ancient sentinels, their bark rough and weathered. The woods felt still, the usual sounds of birds or distant animals muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just the early hour. The further I walked, the more the path seemed to narrow, as if the woods themselves were slowly closing in around me. After about 10 minutes, I noticed something strange. Branches had been broken and arranged in a way I didn't understand. They weren't just fallen. These were purposefully snapped and laid out in patterns, crude shapes, and angles. Some formed crude arrows, pointing deeper into the woods, urging me to go on. My skin tingled as I looked at them, the strange designs seeming almost too deliberate, too out of place in the natural disorder of the forest. But I pushed it aside. It was probably just kids or someone else who had come through, doing whatever it was people did to mark their own little trails. But then I heard something, a faint rustling off to my left. It was almost imperceptible, the sound of something shifting between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I turned my head, but there was nothing there. The trees stood still, their branches swaying lightly in the breeze. I shook my head, trying to push away the creeping unease. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. The forest was always a little spooky, especially when you were alone. After a few more steps, I realized I should probably head back. The path was getting denser, the trees more tightly packed, and I didn't want to get lost. But when I turned around, I froze. The path I had come from was gone. Not just faded or unclear, but completely vanished. In its place was nothing but a thick wall of trees, too dense to push through. The air felt heavier now, the silence almost oppressive. I couldn't hear a single bird call or the usual hum of insects. It was as though the entire forest had gone mute. I tried not to panic, telling myself it was just a bad angle or a trick of the light, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I started walking in the direction I thought I had come from, but everything looked different now. The trees were taller, the underbrush more tangled. The path, if it had ever really existed, was gone. I picked my way carefully through the woods, trying to remain calm, but I felt the first true flicker of fear. My footsteps were unnaturally loud in the stillness, and my breath seemed to echo in my ears. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened. I was only 10 minutes from the cabin. Surely I couldn't be lost already. But no matter which way I turned, I couldn't see any sign of where the path had been. I stopped. The forest had become unnervingly quiet, as though it had swallowed every sound. There was no breeze, no birds, no rustling of leaves. Just the silence, thick and heavy around me. The faintest unease turned into a gnawing worry. I couldn't be far from the cabin. Couldn't be. But every tree, every boulder, every twisted root seemed the same. Nothing looked familiar. Panic began to creep in. I was alone in a vast, silent forest. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I could backtrack, that I'd find my way. But the deeper I went, the more lost I became. I turned and turned, hoping to find some sign of the path or a landmark I recognized. But nothing. I could feel my chest tightening, my breathing shallow and quick. I had to focus. I couldn't let fear control me. The reality of the situation slowly began to sink in. I had no idea how to get back. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I didn't know if I was walking in circles or if the woods were just that disorienting. My legs ached. My feet scraped against rocks and branches. The trees felt like they were closing in, watching me, waiting. It was like being stuck in a maze that refused to end. I finally stopped again, trying to get my bearings. That was when I saw it. Another broken branch, another crude arrow on the ground, pointing me in the opposite direction. My stomach churned. Had someone been following me? Or was this just another trap the forest itself was setting up? I looked around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone else. The woods were just as still as before. I followed the new path, hoping it would lead me back. But the deeper I went, the more unnerving everything felt. It was like I was being led somewhere I didn't want to go. The forest no longer felt like a peaceful retreat. It felt alive, hostile, as though it was testing me, forcing me to find my way out. Eventually, I spotted a break in the trees up ahead. A clearing, maybe. I pushed forward, my legs burning with the effort. As I neared the clearing, I felt a sudden rush of relief. Maybe this was it. Maybe I had finally found a way out. But when I reached the clearing, all I found was a small, unmarked cabin. The wood was weathered, the windows dark. It was nothing like the one I was staying in, and I couldn't remember passing it on the way out. My heart pounded. I was standing in front of something I didn't recognize, something that shouldn't be here. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated. I couldn't explain why, but I knew this wasn't a place I should be. Still, I was desperate to get out of the woods, to find something familiar, so I pushed the door open. Inside was empty, except for a small, rickety table in the center of the room and a few overturned chairs. There was dust everywhere, a faint smell of mildew in the air. As I stepped further inside, I noticed something strange. The floor was littered with broken twigs, small branches. They were arranged in a perfect circle, the kind of pattern you'd make if you were building a fire ring or a boundary. But these weren't just random branches, they were arranged with intention, in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. I turned to leave. That was enough. I had to get back. The cabin had nothing for me, just more of the unsettling feeling the forest had given me. But when I stepped outside, the world was still silent, and the woods felt darker than before. I turned around and made my way back toward what I hoped was the direction of the cabin. I stumbled, exhausted, barely keeping track of where I was. My eyes were scanning the ground, looking for anything familiar, when I saw it. A faint outline in the distance. The cabin. My cabin. I pushed myself harder, almost running now. The trees seemed to thin as I neared, and I could see the familiar porch. I could see the front door, standing just as I had left it. My heart leaped. I had made it back. But as I walked closer, I stopped dead. There, scratched into the front door, deep, long marks, was a spiral. The scratches were fresh, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. It was the kind of mark you'd make with something sharp, something deliberate. The spiral wasn't just a random carving. It was a design, a pattern, something that felt intentionally eerie, something that had been left behind for me to find. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Who would do this? Who could have gotten here before me? The door creaked open as I reached for it, and as I stepped inside, I shut it behind me, locking the door. I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel truly safe again in this cabin, in this forest. But at least for now, I was back. The silence was deafening. Something had happened out there, something I would never be able to explain. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, my first solo getaway in years. It was supposed to be a break from everything, a peaceful retreat where I could recharge. I found a little one-room cabin online that seemed perfect. The listing described it as being nestled in a remote area, far from the noise of the city. It looked charming in the pictures. Wooden walls, a small wood stove, a cozy bed with a flannel blanket, and the best part, it was hosted by someone named Dave. The listing had rave reviews from other solo travelers, and I figured it would be just what I needed. I was used to roughing it and didn't need anything fancy. It was exactly the kind of place I had been dreaming about. When I arrived, it was just starting to get dark. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt road that led to the cabin. I parked my car in front, the crunch of gravel under my tires the only sound in the otherwise quiet area. I got out and stretched my legs, glad to be free from the long drive. As I grabbed my backpack from the trunk, I saw a man walking toward me from the cabin's front porch. He was a little older than I expected, probably in his mid-50s, with a rough face and worn hands. His clothes were simple, jeans and a flannel shirt, but it was clear he worked hard for a living. He didn't smile, but his expression wasn't unfriendly. "You must be the guest," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, a little caught off guard by how quickly he appeared. "I'm Dave. Here are your keys." He handed me a set of old-fashioned brass keys. The tag attached to them was worn and faded, like it had been passed from person to person for years. "Thanks," I said, taking the keys, still not sure what to make of the guy. "Everything's ready inside. You can make yourself at home. There's firewood by the porch if you need it. No one will bother you out here. Just make sure you lock up at night," he added, his eyes briefly flicking to the dark woods that stretched out behind the cabin. I nodded, feeling a little uneasy at the mention of locking up, but chalked it up to the remoteness of the place. I turned to head inside, but before I could open the door, Dave stopped me with a quick, almost hesitant, gesture. "Just remember," he said quietly, "you're alone out here. Quiet. Don't let the silence get to you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just gave a small nod, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The cabin was just as charming as the pictures. There was a small kitchenette, a wood stove in the corner, and a simple bed with a thick quilt. The smell of pine and wood smoke hung in the air, and there was a small bookshelf with a few worn novels. I instantly felt at ease, even though there was something about the whole place that felt off. Too quiet, too isolated. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove to warm up the cabin. The sound of crackling wood was soothing, and I was starting to relax when I heard my phone buzz on the table. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, I'm Dave, the actual host. Sorry I couldn't meet you in person. I'm out of town for a few days, but everything should be fine. Let me know if you need anything. Just don't forget to lock up at night and be careful with the stove. Enjoy your stay." I stared at the message for a second. The Dave I had just met outside had introduced himself as Dave too, but this message seemed to be from a different person entirely, and the timing was strange. The message was polite, but something in the tone felt off. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a mix-up. I had no reason to suspect anything weird yet. That night, after a simple dinner of canned soup, I sat by the fire, reading one of the books from the shelf. The wind outside howled through the trees, and the sound of the storm made everything feel more isolated. I found myself glancing toward the window every few minutes, half expecting to see someone watching from the darkness, but there was nothing. just the trees swaying and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the forest. Around 11 p.m., I decided to turn in. The bed was comfortable, and I pulled the quilt up around me. I lay in the silence, listening to the wind howl and the occasional crack of branches outside. My mind kept wandering back to that strange message from the other Dave. What was that all about? I eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart leapt in my chest, and I froze, trying to listen. Was I dreaming? I couldn't be sure, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was inside the cabin. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and quickly checked the time. It was just past 3 a.m. My mind raced. I had locked the door when I arrived, hadn't I? I slowly got out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf above the stove and crept toward the living area. The door was open. I could see the faint outline of the porch through the gap, the darkness beyond it like an endless void. There was no sign of anyone inside, but the door, it was wide open. I hadn't left it open. I knew I hadn't. I stepped cautiously toward the door, feeling an icy chill run down my spine. My breath seemed to freeze in the cold air of the cabin as I checked the lock. It was still in place, but the door had definitely been opened. I locked it again, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just the wind. I was about to head back to bed when I heard something, a soft scraping sound, like footsteps on the porch. It was faint, but it was enough to send my pulse racing. I stayed frozen for a moment, listening. I couldn't hear any voices, no footsteps retreating, just silence. It felt like the entire world had stopped moving. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly moved to the window and peered out, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing. I stared into the woods, half expecting something to move out there. But there was nothing, just the flickering shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I breathed a sigh of relief and turned away from the window. The next morning, I woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the cabin's windows. It was almost too bright, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. I told myself I was just overreacting. I had been alone in the woods for too long, and my mind had been playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something strange. The door was locked, but the outside handle was slightly turned. Not enough to be fully open, but it was as if someone had tried to get in again. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The rest of the day was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods seemed too quiet, the air too still. That night, I made sure to lock every door and window twice before going to bed. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard the unmistakable sound of the door creaking open again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and my phone and bolted outside. My heart was hammering in my chest as I ran toward the main road, not looking back at the cabin. I wasn't sure who or what was in there, but I didn't want to find out. I managed to make it to the nearest town, where I called the real Dave. I told him everything that had happened. He was confused at first, but then he said something that made my blood run cold. "That's impossible," he said. "I haven't rented out that cabin in years. It's been closed for maintenance. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what his intentions were, but I do know that I barely made it out alive. I never saw Dave again." The weekend getaway had been my idea, a chance to escape the noise of the city and the daily grind. My girlfriend, Sarah, had been working long hours and needed a break just as much as I did. We decided on a cabin tucked away in the Smoky Mountains, remote, quiet, and far from the reach of our phones. The kind of place where you could forget the world for a couple of days. We weren't expecting anything more than a peaceful retreat. The cabin itself was rustic, built with wood that looked like it had been reclaimed from the forest itself. It sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods, the kind of woods that made you feel small and insignificant, as if the trees were ancient and watching you. The air was fresh, the kind of air that made you realize how polluted the city had become. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, which was exactly what we wanted. We spent the afternoon unpacking, settling in, and making the place our own for the weekend. The sun hung low in the sky by the time we finished, casting an orange glow over the landscape. As evening came, we built a small fire outside, sitting on a log near the fire pit and watching the flames dance. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, nothing but the crackling of the fire and the quiet hum of the forest. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so disconnected in such a peaceful way. Sarah leaned back against the log, her eyes closing as she relaxed. I sat beside her, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind rustled through the trees, and the occasional owl hooted in the distance. It was the perfect setting for a quiet, relaxing evening. We ate some snacks and talked about our plans for the next day. Maybe go for a hike or explore the nearby trails. Everything felt so normal, so right? As the night deepened, we went inside, the warmth of the fire replaced by the cabin's dim lights. We made ourselves comfortable, opening a bottle of wine to enjoy before bed. Sarah was already yawning, and I could tell she was ready to sleep. I wasn't far behind, but just as we were about to turn in, I heard something. At first, it was faint, a noise carried by the wind, a sound that didn't quite belong, a scream. It was distant, but unmistakable. Human, not an animal or bird, but the unmistakable, desperate cry of a person. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded slowly. The scream echoed again, louder this time, cutting through the stillness of the forest. It wasn't just a scream, it was a scream of pain, of terror. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the night. The woods were dark, but I could make out the outline of the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. There was nothing out there, just the forest. But the scream came again, much closer this time. Without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight from the table and headed for the door. "Stay here," I told Sarah, my voice firm despite the unease gnawing at me. But she wasn't having any of it. She grabbed her own flashlight and followed me outside. We stepped into the cold night air, the door creaking shut behind us. The forest around the cabin seemed even darker now, the shadows deeper, the trees looming taller. I clicked on the flashlight and swept it across the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The scream came again, just beyond the edge of the woods. I hesitated for a moment, then began walking toward the sound, Sarah right behind me. The further we went, the more uneasy I became. The forest felt different now, as if something was wrong. The trees didn't seem as welcoming anymore. They felt oppressive, closing in on us. I kept my eyes fixed on the flashlight's beam, scanning the ground for anything unusual. But there was nothing, just the dark, the trees, and the cold. We stopped for a moment, listening. The scream had stopped. There was only silence now, heavy and unsettling. My flashlight beam flickered, and I quickly checked the batteries, but they were fine. The woods around us were unnervingly quiet, like the sound had just vanished, swallowed up by the darkness. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us daring to speak. I turned back toward the cabin, the sense of unease growing stronger. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a blur in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to face it, I froze. There, just at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. Person. I couldn't make out any details. Just a silhouette standing motionless, staring at us. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, bumping into Sarah. She gasped and grabbed my arm. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there in the dark, watching us. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Was it someone lost in the woods? A hiker in trouble? But something felt off. The figure didn't look like someone lost. It looked like someone who was waiting, watching. I took a step forward, trying to make out any details. But the moment I moved, the figure disappeared into the trees, vanishing without a sound. I stood frozen, staring into the darkness where it had been, my mind racing. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. "Let's go back inside," Sarah said, her voice trembling now. I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and hurried back to the cabin, our flashlights casting long, shaky beams on the ground as we walked briskly. The door slammed shut behind us as we entered, and I locked it without even thinking. For a long moment, we just stood there, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woods outside were silent now, but the sense of unease still lingered, thick in the air. It was then that I noticed something strange. On the doorknob, a muddy handprint. It was fresh, as if someone had just touched the door, their hand coated in dirt and grime. I felt my stomach drop. How had it gotten there? The door had been locked the entire time we were outside. We hadn't seen anyone near the cabin when we returned. No one had followed us back. I looked at Sarah, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Someone was out there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone was watching us." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. We both stood there, staring at the handprint, the weight of the situation sinking in. I wanted to believe it was just some prank or a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching us, and now they had touched our cabin. I didn't know what to do next. The idea of calling the police seemed pointless. We were in the middle of nowhere, far from any town or help. And besides, who would believe us? A random scream in the woods, a shadowy figure, and a handprint on the door. It all sounded too crazy to be real, but it was real, and it wasn't something I could ignore. We locked all the windows and doors, double-checked everything, and sat on the couch, our flashlights still in hand. I tried to calm myself, to reassure Sarah, but my mind kept racing. I kept thinking about that figure in the woods, how it had just stood there watching us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. We spent the rest of the night awake, jumping at every creak and crack of the cabin. But the woods outside were silent, as if whatever had been out there had gone away. Still, the fear never left. By morning, we were both exhausted, physically and mentally drained. The sun was up, and the world outside seemed calmer, quieter. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But the handprint on the door remained, a silent reminder of the night's events. We decided to leave early. Neither of us could shake the feeling of being watched, the unease still clinging to us like a shadow. I don't know if it was the figure in the woods, or the scream, or the handprint on the door, but I couldn't stay another minute in that cabin. We packed our things quickly, loading them into the car in silence. As we drove away, the cabin receded in the rearview mirror, swallowed up by the trees. We didn't look back. Neither of us spoke for the entire drive back to the city. The woods had claimed their silence once more, but I knew that whatever had happened that night wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only just beginning, and I never went back to that cabin. My uncle's cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was an old place, creaky with age, its wooden beams groaning in the wind like the whispers of something long forgotten. The kind of place that felt like it had secrets buried within the walls. My family would visit every summer, the cabin being a quiet retreat from the hustle and bustle of life. It was a place where my uncle spent most of his time, especially since his wife had passed years ago. He never really talked about her or much of anything, but he liked the solitude. One summer, when I was about 16, I decided to stay a little longer. I wasn't sure what I expected. Some peace and quiet, maybe, but there was something off about that cabin. The walls seemed to close in when I was alone in there, the shadows longer, the nights quieter than they should have been. It was always the same routine. Uncle Sam would disappear into the woods early in the morning, and I'd be left with the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional crack of the floorboards. It was on one of these days that I first discovered the trapdoor. It was in the corner of the living room, just beneath a worn rug that had long since lost its color. At first, I thought it was just part of the house's age, something that had been forgotten over time. But there it was, a rusty handle barely visible, blending in with the wood. I pulled it open, the hinges squeaking loudly, and found a small staircase leading down into a dark, cramped crawlspace. The air smelled musty, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. I had a flashlight with me, and I shone it around the crawl space. The narrow room was packed with old boxes, most of them falling apart or covered in cobwebs. I moved closer, curious, running my hand along one of the boxes. The wood was rough and splintered, the corners rotting with age. Felt like no one had been down here in years, maybe decades. My eyes fell on one particular box. It was smaller than the rest, delicate, almost dainty. I opened it carefully, the lid creaking as I lifted it. Inside were old dolls, their faces yellowed and cracked with time. But what struck me immediately were the nails. Each doll had a nail driven through its eye, a rusty spike poking through the ceramic or wood. Some of the nails were bent at odd angles, others halfway through the heads, but all of them had been intentionally placed. The sight sent a shiver up my spine, a cold knot twisting in my stomach. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. There was something deeply unsettling about them. I glanced around, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, as if I was being watched. But no one was there. I shook the feeling off and decided to leave the crawl space. I didn't touch the dolls again, though. That night, when I went to bed, I kept thinking about them. Why had my uncle kept them? What were they for? The next morning, I found something that I can't explain. The kitchen was empty. The sunlight filtered in through the large windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I made myself a cup of coffee, half in a daze, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. As I turned to set the cup down, I froze. On the kitchen table, sitting perfectly upright, was one of the dolls from the box in the crawl space. It was the same one I had seen last night, the one with the bent nail through its eye. My heart skipped a beat. I was certain I had not brought it upstairs. I hadn't even touched it after finding it. The doll was sitting there, its face twisted in a way that made it look almost alive. I walked around the table, staring at the doll, trying to make sense of it. My uncle was nowhere to be seen. I called out for him, but the house was silent. I searched every room, but he wasn't there. The doll stayed where it was, on the table, staring up at me with that grotesque, nailed eye. It didn't make sense. I thought maybe my uncle had moved it, played some kind of prank on me. But why would he do that? He didn't seem like the type for jokes. I even considered that maybe I had moved it myself and forgotten, but that didn't feel right. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to ignore the strange feeling that clung to me. I kept checking the doll, and every time I glanced at it, it felt like it was closer. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe the lighting played tricks on me. But every time I looked back, the doll seemed to inch toward the edge of the table, its head tilting slightly to one side. That evening, after a long day of trying to shake off my growing sense of dread, I decided I'd had enough. I was leaving. I packed my bags, grabbed my things, and started heading for the door when I heard the sound of footsteps outside. My uncle's voice called out from the porch, sounding normal, like nothing had happened. I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the porch with his old flannel shirt and his usual hard stare. "Where you going?" he asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. I thought I'd head back," I said, trying to sound calm. I don't know, it just doesn't feel right here." He nodded, understanding. He didn't ask what was wrong or press me for details. He just nodded and told me to be careful. But as I started the truck and drove away, the image of that doll stayed with me, etched in my mind. Couldn't shake it. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Didn't think anyone would believe me. My uncle would have probably just laughed it off. Years passed, and I never went back to the cabin. But last year, something pulled me back. My uncle had passed away, and the cabin was being sold. I hadn't thought about the dolls in years, but as I stood on the porch looking at the old place, memories of that day came flooding back. I wasn't sure why I had come back, but there I was. I decided to go inside, just for old time's sake. The house had changed a little over the years, but not much. The smell of dust and wood was still there, lingering in the air. I wandered through the rooms, remembering my childhood summers. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. The same table was there, and in the exact same spot, sitting perfectly upright, was the same doll. The one with the nail through its eye. My heart stopped for a moment, and I backed away slowly. I had to know. I couldn't leave without checking. I pulled open the trapdoor, my hands trembling. The crawl space looked the same dusty boxes piled in corners. I made my way down, the floor creaking under my feet. The box with the dolls was still there, untouched. But as I picked it up, I noticed something strange. One of the dolls was missing, the one with the bent nail, the one that had been sitting on the kitchen table. I left the cabin that day, never looking back. I can't explain what happened or why, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to know. I rented a little log cabin through Airbnb in rural Colorado. It looked perfect on the listing, cute, isolated, a cozy retreat from the noise of everyday life. I was looking for some time to myself, a break from the city, a chance to clear my head. The photos showed a picturesque cabin with big windows looking out onto dense trees and a front porch with a swing. It was the kind of place you imagine yourself sitting on a rocking chair with a cup of coffee, watching the world pass by slowly. The reviews were great, and the host seemed friendly enough. I booked it for a few nights, thinking it would be the ideal getaway. The first night, everything was fine. I drove out of Denver in the late afternoon and took the winding roads into the mountains, passing by small towns and the occasional cabin along the way. It took longer to get there than I expected, but that only added to the charm. I had the whole place to myself. The cabin was exactly as advertised. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a modest kitchen, and a loft bedroom with wooden beams overhead. The air smelled fresh, clean, pine trees and earth. There was a small creek running nearby, and the sound of it was soothing, even in the quiet of the night. I spent the evening in front of the fireplace, just relaxing. The cabin was far enough from any neighbors that all I could hear was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I had no cell service, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful. The second night was uneventful. I spent most of the day hiking nearby trails, taking in the fresh air, and enjoying the solitude. The only thing that caught my attention was the isolation. There wasn't another soul around for miles. The host had mentioned that the nearest town was about 30 minutes away, but it felt like I was the only one for miles. That didn't bother me. I was here to get away, to be alone. It wasn't until the third night that things started to get strange. I was lying in bed, reading a book, when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was the wind. The cabin creaked and groaned in the breeze. But these footsteps were too steady, too deliberate. They were moving around the cabin, slowly, methodically, like someone was walking a circle around the place. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a bear, maybe, or a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. I waited, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The footsteps didn't stop. They went around the cabin, stopping near each window, like someone was looking in. I strained to hear through the walls, but I couldn't make out any voices or sounds beyond the steps. They were muffled but unmistakable. Then, I heard something scrape against the wall, soft, like something was being dragged along the side of the cabin. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear scraping its claws on the wood. I lay there in the dark, listening to the footsteps continue. They circled the cabin several more times, getting closer and closer to the windows each time. Whoever or whatever it was methodical. They weren't in any hurry. It was like they were making sure I knew they were there, like they were watching me. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no service. The only light in the cabin was the faint glow from the fireplace. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could it be someone from a nearby cabin? A local? But there was nothing around for miles. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I hadn't seen anyone on the trail all day. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, hoping it was over. But then, I heard a tapping sound at the window. It was faint, but it was there. Tap, 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 like someone was knocking gently on the glass. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, as if some primal instinct was warning me not to make a sound, not to give myself away. The tapping stopped, and the footsteps resumed their slow circle. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes wide open, straining to hear any sounds that might signal a change. But nothing happened after that. The footsteps eventually stopped, and the cabin went silent again, save for the wind and the occasional crackle from the fire. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink, and the sunrise brought no comfort. I felt an eerie tension in the air, like something was off, but I told myself I was overreacting. I tried to convince myself that maybe it had just been some local wildlife or a hiker wandering nearby. I couldn't find any reasonable explanation for it, but I figured I'd be fine. I made coffee in the morning and tried to shake off the strange feeling that lingered. But when I went to leave, something was wrong. The door was locked. I tried the handle again, thinking maybe it was just stuck. But no, it was locked from the outside. I froze for a moment, unsure what to do. The door had been open just fine the night before when I went to bed. I wasn't imagining this. The lock was secure. I tried to tell myself I was just panicking, that maybe I had locked it myself and forgotten. But I knew I hadn't. I hadn't touched the lock at all. I checked the windows next. They were all locked from the inside. There was no way anyone could have come in and locked the door behind them without me hearing it. And if they had, how had they gotten past the noise of the creaky floorboards and the fire? It didn't make sense. I tried the door again, yanking at the handle, but it didn't budge. I felt my chest tighten, panic beginning to creep in. I grabbed my phone, but as expected, there was no service. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I wasn't in a position to wait around, hoping someone would come by to help me. The only option I had was to break a window and get out that way. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy chair, and slammed it against one of the windows. The glass shattered with a loud crack, and the noise echoed in the quiet morning air. I quickly crawled through the broken window, cutting my hand on the jagged edges of glass as I did. I didn't look back. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I just ran. I ran to my car, got in, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped away from that place. I didn't know what had happened or why, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I drove all the way back to Denver in a daze, my mind replaying the events of the past few days over and over. I didn't tell the host anything. I didn't respond to the messages they sent afterward, asking how my stay had gone. I didn't feel like explaining. I didn't feel like getting into it. All I wanted was to forget about that cabin and move on. I haven't been back to that area since. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't want to know. I've told myself it was just a series of strange coincidences. Maybe someone was messing with me, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that there's something off about that cabin. I don't know who or what was walking around it that night, but I know it wasn't just an animal. It's been months now, and I still don't know what to make of it. But I'm not going back to find out. I've learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is to just walk away and never look back. I had been hiking for hours, the sun long gone and the trail starting to fade. Oregon's dense forests have a way of swallowing everything around you, and after a while, it felt like I had entered some kind of wilderness that had forgotten humanity altogether. The smell of damp earth and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot was the only sound, aside from the occasional distant bird call. The trail had disappeared long ago, and I had veered off in search of a better view, thinking I'd catch a glimpse of something breathtaking. Instead, I found myself in the middle of nowhere, completely surrounded by trees, with no sign of human life. I stopped, taking a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of pine and wet moss. I had no map, no compass, and no real sense of direction. I wasn't lost exactly. I knew the general area I was in, but it felt different now, the forest thicker and quieter than before. I was about to turn around, head back to what I hoped was the right path, when I saw something in the distance. A small structure, almost hidden by the thick vegetation. A cabin. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the kind of illusion you get when your eyes start playing tricks after hours of hiking. But as I got closer, the shape of the cabin became clearer. A small, dilapidated building covered in moss, half hidden behind the thick underbrush. It didn't seem like much, but something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the curiosity that always gets the best of me, or maybe it was just the strange sense of isolation that made me feel like I needed to see what was inside. Whatever the reason, I couldn't resist. The cabin was old, no surprise there. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, their surfaces darkened by age and weather. Some of the logs were split, the cabin sagging slightly to one side. The roof, covered in moss and lichen, had clearly been there for decades, maybe longer. The windows were all covered with grime and dirt, the glass cracked in places, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges, a thick layer of rust staining the metal. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt like it was still holding onto a piece of life, however faded it might be. I stepped up to the door, half expecting it to be locked or boarded up, but it creaked open with only the slightest nudge, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and decaying wood. The light filtering through the cracks in the walls barely illuminated the space inside. The first thing I noticed was the furniture, old, broken pieces of wood and fabric, rotting away in the corners. A chair, its seat sagging with age, sat in front of a fireplace, the stones surrounding it cracked and blackened. A table sat nearby, its legs half gone, the surface covered in dust and dirt. It looked like no one had lived here for years, but the faint smell of something like ashes still lingered in the air, as if the fire had been lit only recently. I walked further into the cabin, my boots scraping the floor as I moved, my eyes scanning the room. I could feel the weight of the place, the silence pressing in around me. The walls were lined with shelves, though most of them were empty, save for a few random objects. There was a rusty pot on one shelf, a broken mirror on another, and what looked like a collection of old, weathered books. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the cabin, yet something about it gave me an uneasy feeling, like it had been waiting for me to stumble upon it. I walked over to the fireplace, my curiosity getting the better of me. The hearth was cold now, but it still had the remnants of something. Ashes, half-burnt logs, and charred pieces of wood littered the floor. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the ashes, and then I noticed it. Something that didn't belong. A fresh set of footprints, small and partially obscured by the dirt and grime. They looked recent, maybe only a day or two old. I froze, my heart rate picking up as the realization hit me. I wasn't alone. I stood up quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. My eyes scanned the cabin again, more urgently this time. It was empty, or at least it seemed to be. I took a few cautious steps back toward the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But then, just as I turned to go, I heard something. It was faint at first, but then it became clearer. A sound, footsteps, not from inside the cabin, but from above on the roof. I froze, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could have gotten up there without me hearing them. The roof was covered in thick moss, and the walls were too high for anyone to just climb up unnoticed. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was up there, walking around on the roof, moving as if they had every right to be there. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of footsteps continued above me, following my every move. I didn't look back as I yanked open the door and ran outside, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I made my way through the thick underbrush. I had no idea which way I was headed, only that I needed to get as far away from that cabin as possible. I didn't stop to catch my breath or think. I just ran, weaving through the trees, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as I could. The woods were dense, and the trail was hard to find, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I could still hear the footsteps, faint but persistent, following me from the roof of the cabin. It felt like I was being hunted, like someone or something was keeping pace with me, waiting for the moment I would slow down. I didn't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch on, the forest blurring around me as I pushed myself harder, faster, desperate to escape. Finally, After what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and found a familiar path. It was a relief, though I knew I wasn't safe yet. My mind raced as I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the woods behind me. But nothing followed. The footsteps had stopped. I didn't stop to rest. I kept moving, walking faster now, trying to get back to civilization. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to see if the cabin was still there, waiting for me. The whole time, the image of those fresh footprints in the ashes haunted me. They were a clear sign that someone or something had been there recently, and that thought stuck with me as I made my way back to the trailhead, my legs aching, my chest tight with fear. When I finally made it back to my car, the sky was dark and the air was still. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I climbed into my car, slammed the door shut, and drove away without a second thought. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that forest, from that cabin, from whatever was lurking there. I never went back to that part of Oregon again, and I never told anyone what happened that day. Sometimes, I wonder if anyone else has found that cabin, or if it's still out there, waiting. But I don't really care. I got out, and that's all that matters. We bought the cabin because we wanted a quiet place to get away from everything. Just the three of us. My wife and I had been dreaming about it since before our daughter was born. She was 1.5 years old when we finally found the right spot. The place was remote, deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest real town. The last mile was a dirt road, barely wide enough for the truck, and if it rained, we knew we'd need 4-wheel drive to even make it up the hill. The cabin was small, just a main room with a kitchenette and wood stove, a little bathroom, and a loft that sat up above the kitchen area, accessible by a steep ladder. We fixed it up ourselves, refinished the floors, patched the roof, made it safe for a kid. We only got to visit once every month or two, usually on a long weekend, sometimes with friends, but mostly just us. We brought the baby monitor on our second trip with our daughter. She was used to sleeping in her own room at home, and the loft worked well as her little sleeping spot. We'd made it cozy with a crib mattress and a few stuffed animals. She didn't fuss up there, and we liked that we could hear her while we sat by the fire or cooked dinner. The monitor didn't need Wi-Fi or anything fancy, just a simple, short-range signal between the two units. That weekend, we got to the cabin just before dark. I carried our daughter up to the loft, set her down in her little bed, and left the monitor on next to her. The receiving end sat on the kitchen counter. My wife unpacked the cooler while I got the fire going in the stove. It was already late fall, cold enough that we needed the heat but not yet deep winter. The trees were bare, and the wind had that empty sound it gets when it runs through dry branches. After dinner, we drank some wine and played cards. The monitor gave off a soft hum, and every once in a while, we'd hear our daughter shifting in her sleep or letting out a tiny sigh. Normal stuff. I was half asleep on the couch when my wife said, "You ready for bed?" And I got up to turn off the lights. That's when the static started. It wasn't loud at first, just a little crackle, like the kind you get when you're between stations on an old radio. I looked at the monitor. The little green light was still steady. I figured maybe the unit had shifted or gotten too close to something metal. But then I heard it. Soft, quiet, almost too faint to notice. A voice. I froze. It didn't sound like our daughter. It was lower than that. An adult voice. Male, maybe, or just hoarse. I turned up the volume. My wife looked up from brushing her teeth. "What is it?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the monitor, waiting for it to happen again. And then it did. "She's not alone." That's what it said. Clear as anything. Just those 3 words, barely above a whisper. I turned to my wife. "Did you hear that?" She frowned. "Probably interference," she said. "These things pick up weird signals sometimes." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But something about the way the voice sounded, it didn't feel like static or bleed through. It felt deliberate. "We don't have neighbors," I said quietly. "No one around for miles. And no service out here. You think someone's just broadcasting for fun?" She hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "I mean, It's probably nothing, but I could tell she was uneasy too. I climbed the ladder to check on our daughter. She was asleep, curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek. The little stuffed bear we'd brought with us was still in her arms. Nothing was out of place. I looked around the loft. Nothing there. No open window. No weird shadows. I stayed up there for a few minutes just listening, but everything was quiet. Back downstairs, I moved the monitor closer to the ladder. I unplugged it and switched to battery in case something in the wiring was acting up. Then we turned in for the night. I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me sit up. There was wind that night, but not strong. Just enough to creak the eaves and knock the odd branch against the roof. The fire burned low and the warmth faded slowly from the room. I kept waking up every hour or so, glancing over at the monitor on the nightstand, listening. Nothing, just the soft static hum. Around 4 in the morning, I finally drifted into a deeper sleep. The next day was cold and gray. We made coffee, took turns holding our daughter while the other got dressed, and tried to laugh off the monitor thing. My wife even joked about ghosts in the wires, but her voice was tight when she said it. I didn't joke back. We took a short hike that afternoon, just around the property. We had 10 acres, mostly wooded, sloping down toward a stream on the far edge. We didn't see anyone. No tracks in the leaf litter, no tire marks near the road. The quiet felt heavier than usual. That night, we went through the same routine. Fed our daughter, put her to bed, checked the monitor. Everything was fine, until around midnight. This time, it wasn't a voice. Not at first, just a sound, faint but clear. Movement, something shifting up in the loft. Then a low thump, like someone had knocked into the wall. Not hard, but enough to make me stand up fast and knock over the chair I was sitting in. I ran to the ladder and climbed it 2 steps at a time. Our daughter was awake, sitting up in bed, eyes wide but not crying, just looking. The air up there felt cooler than it should have been. I scanned every corner of the loft. Nothing. I brought her down and she clung to me, quiet but tense. My wife wrapped her in a blanket and sat with her on the couch while I checked the doors, the windows. Everything was locked. Nothing broken, nothing out of place. The monitor hadn't picked up anything else. Just silence now. I sat up all night, dozing in the chair with the fire low, shotgun propped against the wall next to me. I didn't see or hear anything else, but I didn't sleep either. The next morning, we packed up early. My wife didn't argue. She wanted out too. We drove back to the city in silence, our daughter asleep in the car seat. Back home, I tested the monitor, left it running for hours in different rooms, different outlets. Nothing unusual. No voices, no static, just a normal baby monitor. We didn't go back to the cabin for a month. When we finally did, it was late November. Snow on the ground. I've been thinking about it for weeks, telling myself it was in my head. Just a weird coincidence. Some freak radio signal, some squirrel in the wall. Anything. But the moment we pulled up, something felt wrong. Tracks. Fresh ones in the snow. Around the front steps, circling the cabin. Human tracks. Boot prints. Not mine, not my wife's. Someone had been there. Maybe even still was. I told my wife to stay in the truck and grabbed the shotgun. I walked the perimeter slowly. The tracks came from the woods, not the driveway. No tire marks, no vehicle, just boots. They went all the way around the cabin, paused by the windows, circled the woodpile. Then they led off again back into the trees. I opened the cabin slowly. Everything was untouched. Nothing missing, nothing broken. But there was this smell, faint but sharp, like unwashed clothes and stale tobacco. Someone had been inside. In the loft, I found something that made my stomach turn. One of our daughter's stuffed animals, the bear, was lying on the floor, turned facing the ladder. I didn't remember it being like that. And tucked behind it, nearly hidden by the edge of the mattress, was a single used match. We hadn't used matches. We used a lighter to start the fire. That night, I didn't sleep at all. We didn't even light the fire. Just kept the lights off and sat together, shotgun in my lap, watching the monitor, listening. Nothing happened. In the morning, I found more tracks. Someone had come again sometime in the night. The snow was disturbed near the wood line. Not just boots, there were handprints too in the snow, like someone had crouched there for a long time watching. We left that morning, drove straight to town and called the sheriff's department. They sent a deputy out a few days later, said they didn't find anything. No sign of forced entry, no recent activity. But we knew. We sold the cabin 3 months later. Took a loss on it, but we didn't care. I still think about that voice, about what it said. She's not alone. Whoever it was, they'd been watching, maybe for a while, long enough to know we had a kid, long enough to figure out the loft. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a glitch. It was someone, a real person. And I thank God every day we brought that monitor, because I'll never forget the sound of that voice and the way our daughter looked that night, sitting up in bed, too scared to cry. We'll never go that deep into the woods again. Not without backup, not with a kid. Because out there, when something goes wrong, there's no one to call, no one to help. And sometimes, when the wind dies down and everything goes still, you remember just how alone you really are, until you're not. I had taken the job mostly for the solitude. After everything that had happened back home, I just needed to be away. No noise, no people, no texts, no small talk. Just silence. I'd done seasonal trail work before, but this firewatch gig was different. Weeks alone in a one-room cabin high up in the mountains of western Montana, watching for smoke. That's it. Keep an eye on the tree line, call in if something burns. No company, no distractions. It was perfect. The cabin was old. Built back in the 1930s, part of the original Firewatch system. Wooden, weathered, and small. It stood on a ridgeline about 10 miles off the nearest dirt road, which was already 20 miles past the last bit of pavement. A Forest Service guy had dropped me off in a beat-up truck, handed me a key, a laminated list of radio call signs, and told me to keep the logbook updated. Then he drove off and I was alone. The place had what I needed. A cot, a wood stove, a cabinet with dry food, jugs of water, and a little sink with a hand pump. No electricity, no plumbing. An outhouse about 30 feet downhill. A big map nailed to the wall showed my coverage zone, ringed with red markers. I had a field radio, a pair of binoculars, and a logbook. That was it. During the day, I sat on the deck with a thermos of coffee, scanning the hills. The cabin was on a high ridge with a full 360-degree view. Forested valleys stretched out in every direction. Hawks circled. Squirrels chattered. Once, I saw a black bear picking at something down in a ravine. Nights were cold, but the stars came out sharp and bright like I'd never seen before. No light pollution at all. The Milky Way looked close enough to reach out and touch. I'd been there maybe 6 days when it happened. That evening had been still. No wind, clear sky, just a quiet you don't get anywhere near towns. I'd eaten early, beans and rice, and then sat out on the deck to watch the sun go down. Once the sky went fully dark, I turned off the lantern inside and just stayed out there in the silence. You don't realize how much noise the world makes until it stops. No engines, no hum of a fridge, just the creak of the cabin settling and the occasional call of a night bird. After maybe an hour, I went back inside. I didn't light the lantern. There was enough starlight coming in through the windows to move around. I poured some water into a cup, sat on the edge of the cot, and just listened to the quiet. Then I heard it, thump right above me. First, I thought it was a branch. The roof was pitched and covered in pine needles and sticks that blew off the trees. Maybe a pine cone or something heavier had dropped. But this wasn't a quick thud. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like weight shifting, wood flexing, a slow, dull creak after the thump. I froze, listening. Nothing. The wind hadn't picked up. No rustling outside. No footsteps in the grass. Just that one sound. I waited a long time before moving again. Told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had climbed up. A raccoon, porcupine, something curious. I stood and grabbed the flashlight from the windowsill, clicked it on, and pointed it at the ceiling. There were gaps between the boards. The attic wasn't finished, just rafters and dust and whatever had built up in there over the decades. I had no reason to go up there, no ladder either, just a square panel in the center of the ceiling with old nails holding it down. I swept the beam across the wood, checking for signs of movement. Then I stopped. There were eyes looking back at me. They weren't glowing like in stories or movies. They were just reflecting a little light, like a cat's eyes, but they weren't animal. Too big, too close together. Human eyes, looking straight down through a thin crack in the ceiling boards. I stopped breathing. The flashlight trembled in my hand. Those eyes didn't blink, didn't move. I don't know how long we stared at each other. 10 seconds? 20? I couldn't move. My body wouldn't move. Then they vanished. Just like that, gone. No sound, no scuttling, just gone. I stood there frozen for what felt like an hour, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My mouth had gone dry. My heart was thudding in my ears. Eventually, I stepped backwards to the door, still pointing the light upward. I turned the handle slowly, keeping my ears open for any noise above. When I got outside, I backed away from the cabin, then turned and ran downhill to the outhouse. I crouched behind it, the flashlight turned off, just breathing, trying to listen. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, no sound at all. I stayed there for at least an hour, long enough for my legs to cramp. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. The eyes, maybe they were animal after all. Maybe the crack in the boards made them look human. Maybe I'd been out there too long, and my brain was playing tricks on me. But I knew better. I spent time in the woods. I know what animals look like. I know how silence feels when something is wrong. Eventually, I worked up the courage to go back to the cabin. I didn't go back inside. I just circled it, light off, staying low. I checked the ground around the base of the building. There was no ladder, nothing to climb up with. The support posts were smooth and steep, too high for someone to just jump and grab. I even walked down the trail a bit, checking for footprints. But the ground was hard-packed, dry, and the cabin didn't have an attic entrance from the outside. That part got to me. I thought maybe someone had broken in before I got there. Maybe weeks ago, maybe months. Maybe they were already inside when I arrived, living in the attic, hiding up there, coming down only when they knew I was asleep or outside. I didn't sleep that night, just sat on the deck, blanket around me, eyes on the treeline and ears straining for any sound above. When the sky finally started to brighten, I made my decision. I didn't want to just leave. If there really was someone up there, the next person to take the post could be in danger. And I had no cell service, no quick way to call for help. But I had the radio. I went inside slowly, holding the flashlight and my knife from the kitchen drawer. Everything looked the same. I didn't look up. I went to the radio, keyed the mic, and reported possible security concern at cabin 12. I didn't go into detail, just said I needed someone sent up for safety reasons. The guy on the other end confirmed, said it would take a while. I stayed outside again, didn't even go back in for food. About 5 hours later, a truck came up the trail. The Forest Service guy brought a sheriff's deputy with him. I told them what I saw. I expected them to laugh, but they didn't. They went inside together, flashlight and gun drawn. I waited outside, pacing in the dirt. After maybe 10 minutes, they came out, said they hadn't found anyone. I asked if they'd checked the attic. They said yes. The deputy had pulled the panel down and gone up with his gun ready. Nothing. Dust, cobwebs, a few old boards. But the Forest Service guy paused. He told me he'd noticed something. Nail heads near the panel had been scratched, as if someone had been prying at them from the inside. He didn't speculate, just looked at me and said, "You were right to call." They gave me the option to stay or leave. I chose to leave. The truck dropped me at the station, and I never went back. Later, I heard from another guy working a different cabin that they'd found signs someone had been squatting in one of the outposts further north. Food wrappers, old boots, a pile of clothes. Nobody caught. They figured it was a drifter. Maybe someone who knew the trail systems, hiding out, surviving off supply caches or theft. That was enough for me. I think about those eyes sometimes, the way they watched silent and still, like they knew how not to be seen, like they'd been watching longer than I realized. I still go into the woods, still camp, still hike, but I don't stay in firewatch cabins anymore, and I always look up first. It was late October when my buddy invited me up to his family's hunting cabin in northern Michigan. He'd been going up there since he was a kid, always talking about how quiet it was, how the stars came out in a way you never saw in town, and how you could sit on the porch for hours without hearing anything but wind and trees. We both needed a break from things. Work, stress, everything, and that cabin sounded perfect. Just the two of us, no cell service, miles from the nearest paved road. We packed up his truck with supplies. Canned food, a couple jugs of water, some tools, warm clothes, and rifles. Not for anything serious, just for target shooting, maybe some rabbit if we were lucky. The cabin sat off an old logging road that looked like it hadn't been touched in a decade. The drive up took most of the day. We passed maybe 2 vehicles after leaving the main road. The rest of the time, it was just us and the trees. Dense pine, maples already bare, the ground covered in wet leaves. By the time we pulled up, the sun was dipping low. The cabin itself was small, older than I expected, with faded green paint and a crooked front porch. One of the windows had duct tape over a cracked corner. My buddy unlocked the door with an old skeleton key and pushed it open with his shoulder. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust. There was no electricity, just a wood stove, a propane lantern, a couple oil lamps, and stacks of firewood piled in the corner. The furniture was simple. 2 old recliners, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bunk bed in the back corner. We spent the evening settling in, lit the lantern, warmed up a can of chili, got the stove going. It was colder than we expected once the sun went down, but the fire helped. Around 9, we cracked a couple beers and sat out on the porch with our jackets on, watching the stars come out. It was just like he said, nothing but wind, trees, and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere off in the dark. Could have been deer, could have been anything. You don't think too much about noises like that out there. We turned in early. The bunk bed creaked every time someone moved, and the wind kept rubbing a tree branch against the cabin roof. A long dragging sound that was just annoying more than anything else. I laid there listening to it for a while, thinking about how far out we were. No lights, no sounds of cars, nothing but black trees and stars above them. Eventually, I fell asleep. It was the second night that things changed. Same routine that day. We spent the morning hiking around, following a few old trails that led to a rusted-out deer blind and a dried-up creek. We saw prints in the mud, probably coyote, maybe raccoon. It started raining lightly around noon, so we headed back, played a few card games, made a fire, and ate canned stew. We didn't say much, just sat and let the silence do most of the talking. There's a certain kind of peace that comes with being that far from people. We turned in around midnight. The rain had stopped, but clouds still covered the moon. It was darker than usual, and the wind had picked up. That same tree branch scratched the roof every few seconds. My buddy was out cold on the top bunk within minutes. I laid there, half awake, listening to the wind and the creaking of the cabin. Sometime around 2 a.m., I rolled over to face the window. The lantern was off, but the moon had broken through the clouds just enough to light up the trees outside. That's when I saw her. She was maybe 50 feet out, walking slowly through the trees. Thin, white dress, long, dark hair, pale skin. She moved like she was floating, but her feet definitely touched the ground. I froze. Not out of fear at first, more confusion. There was no way anyone should have been out there. We were 20 miles from town, and the nearest house had to be at least 10 miles in the opposite direction. No trail near us, no campground, nothing but woods. She wasn't looking at me, just moving between the trees like she was following something. Her arms hung by her sides, and her hair swayed slightly as she walked. It didn't make sense. There was no sound, no twigs snapping, no leaves crunching. Just her moving slowly, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. I stared without blinking for what felt like minutes. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to breathe. Eventually, I reached up and tapped the metal frame of the top bunk. It made a slight ping sound, and my buddy stirred. I whispered his name, low and tense. After a second, he sat up, grumbling, asking what was going on. I didn't answer. I just pointed toward the window. He leaned over, looked where I pointed, and waited. She was gone. I sat up, eyes wide, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Not a flicker of white, not a sound. Just wind in the branches. Then we heard it. A laugh. Not loud, not shrill. Just a quiet laugh. A woman's voice, off to the left, echoing faintly through the trees. It didn't sound close, but it didn't sound far either. Like it could have been anywhere out there. We didn't move. My buddy looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both knew we weren't sleeping again that night. We sat up, keeping the oil lamp low, not saying anything. Every now and then, one of us would glance out the window, but she never came back. We didn't hear anything else either. Just that one laugh and then silence. When the sun finally came up, we packed our stuff. Didn't even make coffee. Just threw everything in the truck, locked up the cabin, and drove. We didn't talk much on the way back to town. Every so often, my buddy would glance in the rearview mirror like he expected something to be following us. We told ourselves it was just a squatter, maybe someone living off-grid, maybe a lost hiker, maybe even some crazy prank. But none of it added up. Nobody walks through the woods at 2 a.m. in a white dress 20 miles from town. Nobody laughs like that in the dark and then disappears without a sound. There were no fresh tracks the next morning, no footprints, nothing. Just damp leaves and trees that looked the same as they always did. We never went back. My buddy's family still owns the place, but as far as I know, it's sat empty ever since. He said once that he wanted to sell it, but nobody in his family really wanted to deal with it. They'd used it for hunting since his granddad was young, but after that night, he didn't have any interest in going back. I still think about her sometimes, that pale shape moving between the trees, the way she didn't make a sound, that laugh. I don't tell the story much, not because I'm afraid people won't believe me, but because I'm not sure what I believe myself. I've seen plenty of weird things in the woods, animals moving strangely, shadows that play tricks on your eyes, sounds that don't belong. But this was different. This wasn't some ghost story or campfire tale. It was real. I was awake. I was clear-headed. And I saw her. She was out there. And whatever reason she had for being there, it wasn't good. We weren't supposed to see her. And when we did, she let us know. Just enough to make us leave. And we did. We left that morning and we've never been back. I rented a small cabin in the Adirondacks in late October, about a week before Halloween. The idea came to me after a rough few months. Job stress, a breakup, a general sense that my life was off track. I thought a week alone in the woods, away from everything, would clear my head. I found the place through a small rental site. No reviews, just a few photos. A single-room cabin with a wood stove, a bed, a small table, and a kitchenette. No Wi-Fi, no TV, and more importantly to me, no cell service. Just trees and wind. That's what the listing said. It seemed perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road to the cabin was gravel, about 6 miles off the main highway, and my car didn't love it. The trees were packed tight on both sides, dark even though it was only 4 p.m. The air had that sharpness to it, the kind you only get in late fall, where everything feels thin and brittle. I saw a few old signs along the road, faded, cracked with age, some private property notices, and one about fire risk. But no houses, no other cabins. It felt like the kind of place people forgot about. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but clean. Smelled like pine and old smoke. The front door stuck a little, and there was a draft near the floor, but otherwise it was fine. There was a split woodpile off to the side, probably a year's worth of logs stacked up neatly under a tarp. The bed was firm. The little wood stove worked. I brought canned soup, some freeze-dried meals, coffee, whiskey, and a stack of books. I had a flashlight, a battery radio, and my old camp lantern. I wasn't worried about anything. I'd done solo camping before, and compared to that, this was luxury. The first night, the wind picked up around midnight. The cabin creaked a little, but it was solid. The trees swayed and made that soft hush sound, like a tide pulling away. I lay in bed listening to it for a while. No cars, no planes, no people. Just the wind. I slept better than I had in months. The next day was uneventful. I chopped some wood just to keep busy, walked the trail behind the cabin for a bit, maybe 2 miles in before turning back. No signs of anyone, just deer tracks, a few squirrel nests, and the sound of distant birds. I made coffee that afternoon and sat on the front steps for a while, bundled in my jacket. Felt good to be disconnected. It really did. I didn't realize how much I needed that silence. That second night, it got colder. I loaded up the stove before bed and tucked myself in. Sometime around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure why. It wasn't a nightmare or anything, just that off feeling like something nudging your brain. I lay there in the dark, blinking at the ceiling, waiting to figure out what had stirred me. Then I heard a sound. A light tapping came from the window near the bed. At first I thought it was a branch. There were a few that brushed the roof when the wind blew. But this wasn't random. It was steady, soft but with rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. I stayed still and listened. My heart had already started to speed up. Something about it wasn't right. I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was a branch, the wind, or maybe the sound of ice settling on the window. I didn't look. I didn't want to. I pulled the blanket up and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep much after that. When morning came, I checked the window. Nothing, just a little frost around the edges of the glass. I looked outside. No tracks. The wind had blown all night. If anything had been out there, the leaves and pine needles would have covered it. I still told myself it was a branch. That day, I didn't go for a walk. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering kindling and checking the firewood. Every so often I'd glance at the tree line. There was a strange silence in the forest. Not complete, but heavy, like the birds were keeping quiet. It felt like being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees. Still, I kept busy. I read. I cooked some soup. I didn't drink that night. The third night, I stayed up late, kept the lantern on. I didn't want to go to bed, and when I finally did, I kept my flashlight beside me. The wind wasn't strong that night, just a low breeze. The tapping started again just after 1 a.m. Same window, same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. This time I looked. I rolled slowly and aimed the flashlight toward the glass. Nothing on the other side, just darkness. But I saw something else. 5 marks on the window, faint but clear against the frost. Smudged lines, fingers, 5 human fingers. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, flashlight still on the prints. They were at the bottom of the window. Low. Someone had to crouch or be very short to make them there. I stayed frozen like that for maybe 5 minutes. Then I got up, walked to the door, and opened it. The cold air hit me hard. My breath came out in big clouds. I walked out a few feet, sweeping the flashlight left and right. Nothing. No one. Just trees. I checked around the cabin. No prints. Nothing disturbed. But again, the leaves would cover anything quickly. I stayed awake the rest of that night. In the morning, I checked again. The frost was gone from the window, and so were the prints. I kept telling myself maybe they were my own from earlier. But I hadn't touched that glass. Not since I arrived. I was tired. My nerves were raw. I thought about leaving. I packed my stuff into the car and sat behind the wheel for a good 5 minutes. I wanted to drive back to the highway, find a motel, call someone. But something about leaving felt worse, like giving in to panic. I wasn't ready to admit I was scared. I told myself it was just some weirdo, maybe a hunter or a local messing around, so I stayed. But that day I walked out to the trail again, farther this time. I thought maybe I'd see someone, maybe get a signal. I didn't, but I did find something. About 1.5 miles in, I came across a crude fire pit. Rocks arranged in a circle, old ash in the center. Next to it was an old metal pot, rusted, and what looked like a piece of tarp rolled up tight. No tent, no pack. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't ancient either. Someone had camped here. I left it alone and walked back quickly, keeping my head on a swivel. That night, I locked the cabin door. Not that it would stop much, but it made me feel better. I loaded the stove heavy and sat in the chair with my flashlight and hatchet beside me. I didn't sleep, just listened. No tapping that night, no sound at all. The silence was worse. The next morning, I found prints. Actual prints. Not shoe prints, bare feet. They circled the cabin. Some stepped lightly in the ash and dirt near the woodpile. The toes were clear, narrow feet. Not child-sized, but not large either. I counted at least 10 prints, maybe more. The forest floor made it hard to follow them far. They went off toward the trees and disappeared into the fallen leaves. I wanted to leave then. I did, but something kept me. Call it stubbornness, call it stupidity. I didn't want to believe it was real. I kept thinking maybe it was a prank. Maybe I was overreacting. I'd be gone in a couple days. Maybe it would stop. But it didn't. On the 5th night, I boarded up the windows. Just 1 or 2 panels I found behind the cabin. Old plywood, leftover from something. I nailed one across the inside of the bedroom window and used a chair to block the door. I didn't expect it to stop anyone, but I felt better doing something. That night, I heard something walk around the cabin. Slow steps, crunching leaves, then nothing, then a thump. On the wall, then another, higher, like someone testing it, then silence. I didn't move all night. I left the next morning. I didn't pack up properly. I just grabbed my bag, threw the rest in the trunk, and drove. I didn't even check the cabin one last time. Just drove until I got back to a gas station with a payphone. Called my brother. Told him I was coming back early. I didn't tell him why. A few days later, after I'd had a proper night's sleep, I looked up the property again. Tried to find the listing. It was gone. I checked the site's contact page, sent a message. No response. The rental had no name, no town listed, just a zip code. I checked Google Earth, tried to find the road. Couldn't. It didn't show up on the map. Maybe it was a private road, maybe it was just too small. But it was like it had vanished. I thought about reporting it. But reporting what? No crime, no damage. Just prints. Smudges. Sounds. I still don't know who was out there, or why. But I do know this, whoever it was, they were watching the cabin at night. They didn't try to break in. They didn't leave a note. They didn't take anything. They just wanted me to know they were there. And that's what still gets me. They wanted me to know. My family has owned a cabin up in north-central Pennsylvania since before I was born. It's a squat, cedar-sided thing built by my grandfather and his brothers in the late 60s, back when land was cheap and nobody thought twice about pouring concrete in the middle of the woods. It sits off a long dirt road that doesn't get plowed in winter, about 1.5 miles from the nearest paved road. The only neighbors for miles are scattered hunting camps, most of which sit empty for 10 months out of the year. The kind of place you don't stumble onto unless you're supposed to be there. We only go up once or twice a year now, maybe a week during deer season, and sometimes a long weekend in the summer if someone's schedule lines up. My parents are getting older, and my brother moved out west. I'm the only one who still makes the drive more than once a year. Something about that place keeps pulling at me. I don't know if it's the quiet or the simplicity of it. No phone service, no internet, just a wood stove, a creek out back, and a cot to sleep on. The air smells like pine and wet moss. It's always cold in the shade, even in July. That December, it had snowed early. Not deep, but enough to coat the ground and cling to the tree trunks in soft, dirty clumps. I'd gone up on a Friday morning with plans to stay the weekend and get the place ready for real winter. The roof needed checking, the pipes had to be drained, and I wanted to split and stack the last of the firewood. I'd left work a few days early, looking forward to the silence. When I got there, the cabin was just as I'd left it in October. A little more snow on the roof, a couple deer tracks through the yard, and a faint, musty coldness inside that always took a while to shake off. The woodpile was about half what it should have been, so I made a mental note to start splitting right away. The sun sets early in December, especially up there in the mountains where it dips behind the trees before 4. I brought in my gear, shook the snow off my boots, and lit the propane heater we keep for emergencies. I usually prefer the wood stove, but it takes a while to get going, and I wanted the cabin warm fast. The place is just one big room, plus a narrow bathroom with a compost toilet. One twin cot, a shelf of canned food, and a few oil lamps. It's not much, but it's always felt safe. I ate lunch, just a peanut butter sandwich and some jerky, and then went back outside to start splitting. The axe was where I always leave it, wedged into the stump next to the woodpile. The air had that heavy stillness that always settles after a snow. I could hear the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the cold, and every now and then, a distant crow. I got into a rhythm pretty quick. Split, stack, split, stack. The sweat built up under my jacket, but I didn't want to stop. Felt good to work. After a while, I started to hum without realizing it. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just letting the cold air and muscle movement take over. I don't know what made me stop, but at one point I leaned back to stretch and something caught my eye. The woodpile looked wrong. Bigger. Not dramatically, but definitely taller than it had been. I frowned and stepped back a few feet. I'd only been working for maybe 2 hours. I couldn't have added that much. But there it was, an extra row of logs stacked neat, bark facing out just the way I did it. I stared at it for a long time. Then I looked down at the stump. My axe was there. Same spot. Nothing out of place. I shook my head and figured maybe I just misjudged. It was cold. I was tired. Maybe the stack looked bigger in the low light. The sun was already getting close to the ridge. I told myself I'd finish that row and call it a day. I reached for the axe. It wasn't there. I blinked, looked again. Just a bare stump. No axe. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the ground. Sometimes I lay it down without thinking. Maybe it slid off. But the snow was undisturbed around the stump. No marks, no tracks, just hard frozen prints from my boots and a few deer trails off toward the creek. I stepped back and looked at the pile again. I didn't stack that last row. I know I didn't. It was newer wood, too green. You could still see the moisture along the grain. I never split green wood in the winter. It's not worth the effort. My mouth felt dry. I didn't want to go inside yet. Something about walking away from the stump without the axe felt wrong. But I wasn't about to go digging through snow for it in the dark. I backed toward the cabin, watching the trees. Inside, I locked the door. We have one of those old slide bolts you can latch from the inside. It's not much, but it's something. I walked a slow lap of the cabin, checking the windows. Nothing broken, nothing open. Everything was exactly the way I'd left it. I sat on the cot and took off my boots. My socks were damp with sweat, and my hands were starting to ache from the cold. I held them over the propane heater and tried not to think. The axe didn't just vanish. Someone took it. Someone who brought their own wood, split it, and stacked it right next to mine. I didn't hear them, didn't see them, and there were no new footprints in the snow. The cabin has 2 small windows and 1 main door. No attic, no basement. You can walk the perimeter in about 15 seconds. I considered going back out to check for tracks again, but the thought made my stomach turn. Instead, I stayed inside, ate a cold can of soup, read a few pages from an old paperback someone left behind years ago. But I kept looking up, listening. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it rushing through the trees like a wave. Every so often something would creak or thump on the roof, and I'd sit up fast, heart pounding, only to realize it was just snow or a branch. I didn't sleep much. I left the lantern burning low on the shelf and kept the hatchet by my cot. It wasn't much, but better than nothing. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard footsteps outside. Slow, crunching ones. Just a few. I held my breath and waited, but they didn't come closer. Then nothing. Just the wind again. The next morning, everything looked normal. The woodpile was the same size as the night before. Still had that new row of green logs. Still neat. Still damp. But the axe was back. It was wedged into the stump just like it had been before. Same angle. Same dark-stained handle. I walked up slowly, like it might disappear again if I got too close. I looked around, scanning the ground. Still no new tracks. Just mine from the day before, already crusted over and half filled by snow. I didn't touch the axe. Not yet. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, then checked the trail back to the car. Nothing. No tire marks, no footprints, no sign of anyone. I went back inside, made coffee on the old camp stove, and stood by the window watching the tree lean. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what to do about it. No cell signal, no landline. The nearest gas station was over 20 miles away, and I'd already put snow chains on just to get in. I could pack up and leave, but it felt like giving in, like surrendering the one place that had always felt solid, safe. So I stayed. I told myself it was probably just some hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the woodpile low and decided to help. Maybe they'd taken the axe as a joke or to sharpen it. Maybe they didn't mean anything by it. But that didn't explain the lack of tracks, or how they got that close without making a sound. That afternoon, I split more wood, slowly, watching the trees between each swing. Every little movement caught my eye. A bird flitting, a squirrel bolt up a trunk. The axe felt heavier than usual in my hands, like it didn't want to be used. I finished early and went back inside before dusk. That night, I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no wind, just the deep, unsettling quiet of a frozen forest. But in the morning, there was something new. A single log, not stacked, just sitting in front of the door, split clean down the middle, green like the others, still wet. I opened the door slowly. No prints, nothing around it. I stared at it for a long time before finally picking it up. It was cold, smooth, too fresh to burn, but perfectly cut. Someone had left it for me, or at me. I didn't go back inside. I packed up, fast, threw my gear in the truck, scraped the windows, and got the hell out. I didn't even take the axe. I left it there, sunk deep in the stump. I didn't want it anymore. The road out was worse than I remembered. Ruts frozen solid, trees leaning in close. Every bend felt like it would open into something I didn't want to see. But I kept going. I didn't stop until I was halfway to Williamsport. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. Not my dad, not my brother. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I haven't gone back. That was 4 years ago. Every now and then, I think about that axe. About the way it disappeared and came back like nothing happened. About the extra wood. The single log on the porch. It was no ghost, no spirit, just someone or something real, flesh and blood. A person who knew those woods better than I ever could. Who could move without sound. Who could watch without being seen. They were The first time we arrived at the cabin, I thought it would be the perfect weekend getaway. It was remote, tucked away deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines. I had always wanted to escape to somewhere quiet, far from the noise of the city, and this cabin seemed like the perfect spot. The air smelled fresh, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. We parked our car, unloaded our bags, and walked up the creaky wooden steps, the old porch groaning under our weight. The cabin itself looked like something out of an old picture. It had a stone chimney, a steep slanted roof, and dark wood siding. Inside, the floors were worn, the wood polished smooth from years of use. The furniture was a bit outdated, but everything was in its place, except for a thick layer of dust on the surfaces. The whole place felt like it had been frozen in time. The fireplace was cold, but there was an old box of firewood stacked in the corner. There was a small kitchen, a cozy living room, and a lofted bedroom with a single window that overlooked the woods. We were just a group of friends looking to relax, but there was something about the place that made me uneasy from the start. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of wood and something faintly musty. Maybe it was the age of the place, or maybe it was just the isolation. But as I set my bags down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though no one was around. The first night was uneventful. We made dinner, ate, and shared a couple of beers. enjoying the quiet and the novelty of being so far from civilization. It felt like a dream to be in such a peaceful place, far from work and all the noise of everyday life. But as the evening wore on, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right with me. The windows in the cabin were old, with thin curtains that didn't do much to block the view outside. The wind picked up, making the trees outside sway, casting long shadows across the walls. The occasional creak of the cabin settling echoed through the empty space, making it seem alive in a way that made my skin crawl. We didn't think much of it at first. We'd just gotten there, and we were still getting settled. But when we turned on the TV, things started to take a strange turn. The TV was ancient, a bulky box sitting in the corner of the living room. It didn't even have a remote, just dials on the side to change the channels. After some fiddling, we managed to get it working. There was only one channel that came in clearly, an old VHS tape playing static at first, then it smoothed out into a picture. It was a home movie. It didn't seem that strange at first. The tape had clearly been sitting in a box for decades. The label was faded, and the edges of the tape were worn from years of use. It was grainy, the quality far from what we were used to today. But curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to watch. What harm could it do? It was just a home video. What could possibly go wrong? We all sat back on the old couch, the smell of stale air mixing with the mustiness of the VHS tape. The movie began, showing a family sitting down to dinner at a wooden table. The kind of meal you'd expect to see in the 1980s. Simple, hearty, with the clink of silverware against plates filling the silence. A mom, dad, and two kids, all smiling, talking, laughing. It was like watching a piece of someone else's life. There was a warmth to it, a sort of nostalgia, like looking at old family photos. But then the camera zoomed in on each person's face, and that's when things started to feel off. The camera lingered on the mother for a moment too long, capturing her soft smile as she looked at the camera. Then it moved to the father, a serious expression on his face as he looked down at his food, barely acknowledging the camera. Next, the kids, two young boys laughing and poking each other. And then the camera zoomed in on the window behind them. It was subtle at first, like the person filming didn't realize it was happening. But the more I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. The figure stood outside, just beyond the window. First, it was hard to make out. The window was fogged up slightly, and the light from the kitchen cast strange shadows. But the longer the camera held on the shot, the clearer it became. There was a man outside, his face pressed against the glass, watching the family. He didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes wide, staring at them. There was something unsettling about his stillness. His face was pale, almost sickly looking, and his eyes were wide open, unblinking. The camera lingered on him, as though the person filming didn't notice what was happening. The family continued eating, oblivious to the man outside. The man didn't blink, didn't move. It was as though he was frozen in time, his gaze fixed on the family. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Couldn't look away. The man didn't look like he was lost or confused. He looked like he had been waiting there for a long time, watching them with no intention of leaving. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the camera shifted away. It didn't acknowledge the figure outside, and the film continued with the family eating and talking as though nothing was wrong. We all sat in silence as the video continued, but I couldn't focus on anything else. My mind kept going back to that face at the window. What did it mean? Why was he there? It wasn't just some random figure, it was deliberate, calculated. Whoever he was there for a reason. When the video finally ended, there was an eerie silence in the room. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to say. It was just a home movie, right? Just an old family video, no big deal. But the feeling of unease that settled over us was impossible to ignore. It was like the air in the cabin had changed. It felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us. I tried to shake it off, but it stuck with me. We had all seen the same thing, and none of us could deny how strange it was. I stood up and walked to the window, trying to clear my head. The woods outside were dark, the trees rustling softly in the wind. But there was no one out there. No man standing at the window, staring into the cabin. It was just the quiet, dark forest, stretching out as far as I could see. But my heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the image of the man's face pressed against the glass. I turned back to the others, but no one was speaking. They were all staring at the TV, still processing what we just watched. That was weird. One of them finally said, breaking the silence, but his voice sounded distant, like he wasn't fully present, like his mind was still on the video. We decided to go to bed early that night, hoping sleep would help us forget the odd feeling that had taken over the cabin. But as I lay there in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin walls seemed like a warning, like something was out there, watching us. The next morning, we tried to act normal. We ate breakfast, made coffee, and spent the day hiking through the woods, hoping that getting some fresh air would clear our heads. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more we explored the area, the more the unease settled into my bones. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump, made me look over my shoulder. It felt like we were being followed, like there was something in the woods just beyond our sight, lurking in the shadows. When we returned to the cabin that evening, it was already getting dark. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I felt the weight of the day pressing on me, but I knew we couldn't ignore what we'd seen. We needed to figure out who the man in the video was and why he was standing outside that window. We went to the old box of tapes again, digging through the dusty collection to find another one. This time it was different. This one was labeled Christmas 1985. The label was barely readable, but we popped it into the VHS player anyway. The video was clearer than the last one, showing a family gathered around a Christmas tree, smiling, laughing. But once again, as the camera panned across the room, it lingered on the window. And once again, a man's face appeared, pressed against the glass. This time, though, we could see him more clearly. He looked older, his hair longer, but the expression in his eyes was the same, intense, unblinking, almost predatory. I stood up from the couch, my heart racing. This time, I couldn't deny it. This wasn't just some random person. This was the same man, the same face. He had been watching that family for years, and now he was watching us. I rushed to the window, my breath coming in short gasps. And there, standing in the dark at the edge of the woods, was a figure, just standing there like he had been waiting for us, watching us. I turned to the others, my voice shaking. "We need to leave, now." Without a word, we grabbed our things and ran out of the cabin. We didn't care about packing up or being careful. We just needed to get out, away from that place. We piled into the car, speeding away from the cabin. The image of that man's face burned into my mind. As we drove down the dark, winding road,